Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering my pick for the best Arcane Archer build in Baldur's Gate 3. The Arcane Archer is the ultimate problem solver. This is probably the single most consistent damage dealer in the game now, adding to Archer's already incredibly consistent, uninterruptible, ranged damage, the ability to just do damage to enemies without rolling any dice or even needing to see them. Combine that with your incredible crowd control abilities, usable multiple times per turn and many times per short rest, and you have a character that just gets things done. No matter what the situation is, the Arcane Archer will always have an answer, even if that answer is just filling it full of arrows. This character is also quite easy to pilot with powerful defensive capabilities in addition to its very strong offense, but also gives you a lot of interesting tactical options. So whether you're a newer player or a much more experienced player, I think that this build has a lot to offer because this character is just so versatile, so powerful, and so incredibly consistent. I'm using Astarion as the example character here because, from a mechanical standpoint, he makes the most powerful character to build this kind of damage dealer with. His early game bonus to hit from the happy buff and his late game bonus to damage, if you choose to go that story event, increase what this character is trying to do dramatically. We're making a lot of attacks every turn, so bonuses to hit just mean a lot more hits, and bonuses to damage just mean a lot more damage. So Astarion's unique story mechanics increase the power level of this build immensely. I think it's not that far out of flavor as well. He's on a quest for more magical power and likes to stick to the shadows, which this build as a ranged fighter will be doing a lot, so an Arcane Archer's not that unusual a route to send him down, in my opinion. Of course, if you want a character whose default class is fighter, you can build this with Lae'zel, and as a Githyanki, she gets a lot of bonuses that will be helpful to this build also. And if you're building this as a custom character, then what race you pick mostly doesn't matter, but there are a few that do get some pretty nice bonuses. Dwergar's out-of-combat invisibility is probably the strongest. The ability to start an encounter from anywhere in the arena is incredibly strong for an archer, especially one that can shoot around corners, because you can force enemies to walk long distances or have to go up heights in order to get to you, and prevent enemies from having height advantages against you themselves. So Dwergar is an excellent choice. Wood Elf or Half Wood Elf's bonus movement speed are also incredibly good. Of course, as a ranged character, we want to stay primarily out of melee, so having more movement speed makes it easier for us to do that. Halfling's ability to reroll ones is excellent, and Gnome's advantage on mental saving throws is incredible for this build. We're going to be nigh unkillable through physical damage, thanks to our high hit points, great AC, and the fact that we're playing at long distances. So the main weakness of this character from a defensive standpoint is going to be if we get targeted by mental saving throws. Gnome makes us much safer in case of that. So all of those races will make this character even more consistent than it already is. But again, it mostly doesn't matter. We get all our proficiencies, so you can pick what you want for flavor reasons. For this build, we will be focusing on a monoclass Arcane Archer, not only because this is part of my simple class build theories, but also because I think that monoclass is the strongest way to build Arcane Archer. There are a couple multi-class options that we can benefit from, but just taking levels in Fighter gives this character so much power at every level up. Fighter gets additional feats, and the extraordinarily powerful Capstone ability at level 11 to make a third attack in a turn, which takes our damage from excellent to phenomenal. And as an Arcane Archer, as we level up, we get additional uses of our arrows and access to more special arrows, making the character have a lot more tactical options and a lot more ability to use them. If we are multi-classing, I wouldn't recommend taking more than one level in another class, and if you do that, you would want to take it at first level. A level of Rogue can get you a lot of skill access and a sneak attack die to increase your damage early on. A level of Bard can do a very similar thing with a lot of skill access and a little bit more supporting capabilities, and a level of Cleric can give you a ton of support spells, the Bless spell to increase your accuracy even further in the early game, Sanctuary to get you out of a bind, and War Domain Cleric gets you additional bonus action attacks, 3 per day, which can increase your burst damage at the beginning of key encounters. So those are the multi-class options, but for this build, we're going to be starting with a level of Fighter. For our fighting style, there is of course only one choice for the Arcane Archer, and that is the archery fighting style. Not only is this an incredible boost to what the character is trying to do, I already talked about how good bonuses to hit are when we're making this many attacks, but this is one of the major draws to being an archer in the first place. No other type of character gets such a massive bonus passively from the first level to their core playstyle as an archer with the archery fighting style. So not only is this a great thing that we should pick over the other options, it's a great reason to be this character in the first place because of how incredibly powerful archery fighting style is. For our ability selection, the game is going to try to trick you here. With most characters, you can get away with the default attribute spread and just be a little weaker than if you'd customized your attributes, but an Arcane Archer that doesn't change their starting attributes is going to be completely useless. So you absolutely have to make sure that you adjust these when you are speccing into Arcane Archery. We're going to be taking all of our points out of strength and putting them into dexterity. This character, of course, makes its attacks and does damage based on its dexterity as a ranged character, so we want the highest dex possible. The real question is, do we take intelligence? As an Arcane Archer, the save DCs against our Arcane Archer effects, the special arrows that we fire, are based on our intelligence. So the higher our intelligence, the more likely those are to succeed. There are ways to replace our intelligence. If we take 8 intelligence and use the headband of intellect, we will still get 16 intelligence effectively, and so can succeed on, so enemies will fail those saves just as often as if we invested into intelligence in the early game. We won't want to use that item forever though, and I actually am pretty happy with this character just taking 16 intelligence. This will give you high save DCs in the early game even before you get the headband, so doesn't force you to go out of your way to get that early, and will carry your save DCs on into the late game, making the character excellent at succeeding on locking down enemies with your abilities, even after we don't want to have the headband equipped because we have better options in the helmet slot. In addition to that, we're taking 14 Constitution, combined with Fighter's high base hit die and the high armor class we'll have. That will be plenty of hit points to keep ourselves alive, and 12 Wisdom because, again, the main thing that this character is worried about is failing saves against mental effects, so the higher our Wisdom, the better. One nice knock-on effect, too, of having high intelligence is that in the late game especially, there are some dangerous enemies with intelligence targeting saving throw effects, so having 16 intelligence actually makes us have a decent shot at saving against those, especially if we're playing as a gnome and have advantage on the saves. For our skill selection, there's not really that much that we particularly need. If you are taking a background that can give you sleight of hand proficiency, then that's pretty good for this character because we have high dexterity, so sleight of hand proficiency can be very useful for us to be the party's lockpicker as a dexterity-based character. But other than that, this character is not going to be making a lot of skill checks and not going to be engaging in dialogue that frequently, so what skills you take here don't matter. You should take acrobatics so you're not as easily pushed around, but other than that, you can take whatever you want for flavor. That's all the decisions that we have to make at level 1. Let's move on to level 2. At character level 2, we don't have to make any new decisions, but do get access to Action Surge, which is probably the single best class feature in the entire game. I don't have to spend too much time talking about why this is so good, but it is especially good for Arcane Archers, because so many of our actions just remove an enemy from combat, or can do AoE damage to an entire encounter, so layering multiple of them in the same turn, especially in the early game, is even better for this character than for another character. 2 piercing shots with an action surge in the early game will just blow up a lot of early game encounters entirely. So the fact that we get so many cool and powerful effects that we can use with our actions makes action surge even better for this character than for every other fighter, and it's already insane for every other fighter, so being a fighter pays dividends yet again. At character level 3, we get to take our subclass, and of course the subclass that we are going to take is the Arcane Archer. Arcane Archer gives us a bunch of things at level 3. Firstly, we get to choose 3 of the 8 possible arcane shots, which I'll talk about in a second. We also get to choose one of 3 cantrips. The cantrip that we're going to take is Guidance, because, of course, Guidance is probably the best spell in Baldur's Gate 3. Even though we get this a couple levels late, it will still make the every skill check that you make in the game vastly easier. And even if you have another character that can cast Guidance in the party, having a second copy means that that character can react with something else to a dialogue check or a skill check that you might make. So your cleric can cast Enhance Ability, and your Arcane Archer can cast Guidance, and you'll succeed on skill checks even more easily. It's also a concentration spell, and it's a cantrip, and being a concentration spell is a pretty big advantage for a character like this. There are items that want you to be concentrating on spells, and that are very good for this character, and there are lithid powers that care about concentrating on spells, so just having an at-will concentration spell is also a pretty huge advantage for a martial character. In addition to that, we get to choose 3 of these 8 arcane shots, so I'm going to talk through each of these and talk about why you might want to take them. The first one that we are always 100% of the time going to take is Arcane Shot Banishing Arrow. This is basically a 4th level spell that only takes part of your action and does damage when the default of the spell doesn't. Arcane Banishing Arrow just does the banish spell, the 4th level spell that also requires concentration, when you shoot an enemy with it. So it's getting a vastly powerful ability wildly early and for way less expenditure of resources and action economy. Banishing an enemy for 2 turns can let you just clean up every other enemy in the encounter, and then you can set up traps and all sorts of cool, like hazardous areas and good locations for your characters for when they return from the banishment, and then you can just destroy them many on one when they finally return. This is one of the best crowd control effects in the game, and it also importantly targets the enemy's charisma save. A lot of enemies in the game have very weak charisma saves, so Banishing Arrow is especially effective against them because you will succeed on those enemies extremely reliably. So we're always taking Banishing Arrow. I think every Arcane Archer should take this. In addition to that, we're going to want one of the arrows that doesn't require you to roll dice in order to do damage. As I say frequently, the enemy of optimization is randomness, and for your honor mode runs, we want to reduce randomness as much as possible. So effects that don't require us to roll dice in order to kill enemies give many fewer opportunities for the dice to ruin our day. Arcane Archer gets access to 2 of these, and we want to take at least 1 for certain. The first of these is Seeking Arrow, which is basically Magic Missile, but for your bow. It hits any enemy within 60 feet, and you don't have to have line of sight on them. Just like Magic Missile, you can target this ability around corners as long as they're within the range. And it will deal the full damage of your weapon, and apply most on-hit effects from your weapon, so the damage on this can be very high without ever having to roll dice. They also get a saving throw, or they receive Fairy Fire. That's not a big deal. Mostly this is for finishing off low-health enemies without having to potentially miss with an attack. So Seeking Arrow in general you're not going to care that much about the Fairy Fire, but it's such a strong ability because it doesn't roll any dice. The second of these is Piercing Arrow. Piercing Arrow is shorter ranged, it's only 30-foot range, but it's AoE. It fires an arrow in a straight line beam and hits everything within that 30-foot straight line. Enemies will take the full damage of your weapon, and then this tooltip is also a little bit messed up, so it says each target must succeed a saving throw or be dealt an additional 1d6 piercing damage. That's not actually true. They get a saving throw for half damage on that extra d6 only. So they'll always take the full damage of your weapon, and then they roll a dexterity save. If they fail, they take an extra d6. If they succeed, they take a d6 over 2. So the difference between succeeding and failing is only 1.75 damage on average. Again, the saving throw here mostly doesn't matter. The main thing is that you do your full weapon damage with no die rolls involved at all to every enemy in a straight line. Which of these you take is a little bit up to personal preference. If you're playing a party that wants to operate at really long ranges, Seeking Arrow may be better. But for my money, the better choice in the early game is Piercing Arrow. One thing that archers aren't great at dealing with is lots of small enemies, because you have to target your enemies individually, typically. Having a super reliable, in fact, an infallible AoE attack lets you solve a problem that this character normally wouldn't be good at solving. We'll pick up Seeking Arrow later on anyways, because it's still good in a lot of circumstances, but Piercing Arrow, I think, is typically going to be better in the early game. One other thing to be aware of with these two also is that the tooltips for the damage they do is a little bit messed up. We're going to take the sharpshooter feat next level, and the sharpshooter damage will show up in the attacks for these weapons, but won't actually be dealt because they don't roll attacks. So sharpshooter doesn't apply to seeking or piercing arrow. So you have to subtract 10 from the listed damage in order to see how much damage they're actually going to do. Just important to keep that in mind when you're planning your turns. For our last arrow, we want additional crowd control, and I think there's really 3 possible choices. 2 arrows we can mostly discount. Bursting arrow is certainly not a bad arrow, but in general, the AoE damage from this is going to be worse than the AoE damage from piercing arrow, so I would typically not recommend taking bursting arrow. And beguiling arrow applies charm to an enemy, which is by far the weakest of the possible crowd control effects. So unless you have a glamour bard in your party that specifically cares about charming enemies, I think you can safely ignore beguiling arrow for most arcane archers. That means we're choosing between enfeebling, grasping, and shadow arrow for our last arrow. Enfeebling arrow is pretty solid, especially if you have bleeding effects in your party or ways to reduce enemy constitution saves. Enfeeblement is a pretty powerful effect. It's not something I would usually spend a spell slot on, but from an arrow, reducing enemy weapon damage by half is really good. Enfeeblement reduces enemy damage, and there's a lot of early game bosses that this just completely trivializes because they do so much less damage if they're enfeebled. Grasping arrow is by far the most damaging arrow and slows enemy movement speed. This 10-foot movement speed reduction stacks with the Ray of Frost movement reduction, so can reduce an enemy to an absolute crawl. It also lasts for 10 turns and deals damage every time they move, so this will end up being the most damage overall, especially in longer encounters. Finally, Shadow Arrow is by far the strongest of the crowd control effects. Blinded is just a very good crowd control effect that more or less removes most weapon-based enemies from the game. Enemies who are blinded can't target things outside of melee range of themselves and have disadvantage on all their attacks, and you have advantage on all your attacks against them, so Shadow Arrow is the best of the crowd controls. Any of these choices are really solid, whether you take Enfeebling, Grasping, or Shadow Arrow. Of the 3, I'm going to recommend that you take Grasping Arrow. I think that it's really solid in the early game just because of the amount of damage that it does, so if you're just looking for additional damage, Grasping Arrow is great, but Shadow Arrow is also excellent. I think that Banishing Arrow will usually see use over Shadow Arrow for early game fights, but later on we're going to want both regardless. At character level 4, we get to take our first feat, and of course the feat that we're going to take is Sharpshooter. As an archery build, we want to do the most possible damage. We have the archery fighting style, so we're going to land our shots extremely reliably. Even though Sharpshooter doesn't work with Piercing Arrow, it works with our other special arrows, the ones that roll attack rolls, though often you'll want to turn it off if you just really want to land the effect of, say, a Banishing Arrow, and don't have a good chance to hit. But Sharpshooter is still just so much damage and increases the power of this character so vastly that it's still just the feat that we want to take for sure. It also, of course, makes you better at shooting up, which is very important in some arenas where shooting up at enemies on high ground is a very important tool. So Sharpshooter just increases the power level of this character so much that you should never leave home without it. If you're finding that one of the abilities that you took at previous levels is not working out, you can replace it. At this level, you probably won't need to replace anything, but maybe you're finding that Piercing Shot isn't coming into play because your party is really long range and you want to replace it with Seeking Shot instead. That's definitely a change that you can make. Other than that, no other decisions at level 4, so let's go straight to level 5. At character level 5, we don't have any decisions to make, but we do get extra attack, which, once again, is one of the best class features in the entire game, and this character uses it even better than every other character. Extra attack lets us fire multiple arcane arrows in the same turn, and one of our arcane arrows is effectively a 4th level spell in the form of Banishing Arrow, so this lets us cast multiple 4th level spells in the same turn at level 5. Not even sorcerers can do that, and they're the casting lots of spells in a turn class, so Arcane Archer gets access to some pretty overwhelming Nova turns, for when you really just want to win a fight, you can spend your resources on using multiple arcane arrows in a single turn and just wipe the floor with enemies. Even if the fight has several strong enemies, or if they're passing their saving throws, firing out 2 banishes in a turn is enough to turn pretty much any fight in your favor. Conveniently also, at this level, we have 4 uses of Arcane Arrow per short rest, and with Action Surge and Extra Attack, we can make up to 4 attacks in a turn in the opening round of combat. That will allow us to spend our entire resource load all at once in order to just win an encounter outright. Imagine our weapon does 15 damage on average, not unreasonable at this level. If we spend all 4 charges on Piercing Arrow, that's 60 AoE damage with no saving throw that we can do with Action Surge and Extra Attack. So you can just blow up entire encounters without ever rolling dice, just by virtue of having these abilities. Or, of course, crowd control entire large groups of enemies, banish your most dangerous foes from the battlefield easily. The possibilities are endless. This character gives you a tremendous amount of power, and it's all front-loaded at the beginning of combat because Extra Attack and Action Surge let you spend everything all at once. At character level 6, we get an additional feat, because again, being a fighter is great. And the feat that we're going to take, we have a fairly interesting choice here. We can either take an ability score improvement to boost our dexterity, or we can take the alert feat in order to just guarantee that we're going first. If you've been watching my videos frequently, you can probably guess what the answer here is going to be. I'm going to suggest that we take alert. Getting +8 to your initiative is incredible, and there are other ways to boost your hit chance and damage at this point. For example, the Graceful Cloth will give you 18 dexterity without having to spend any points in it. So the alert feat just guarantees that you go before every enemy at this point in the game, and you could banish them before they act, blind them, slow them with Grasping Arrow, or just blow them up before they get to act by doing overwhelming amounts of damage. So alert just remains the best feat for honor mode. This character is no exception and should definitely grab it. At character level 7, we get a number of other Arcane Archer abilities. Firstly, we get additional uses of our Arcane Arrows. Now, there's only 1 pip shown in the level up screen here, but you actually get 3 more uses of Arcane Arrow per short rest at level 7. That takes us up to 7 uses per short rest, or 21 per day, before you even take into account additional short rests from bards or whatever in the party, which vastly increases both the longevity and power of this character. Just makes you way easier to spend resources to win encounters outright when you have more resources to spend. We also get Magic Arrow, which mostly won't come up because we're going to be using a magic bow, so all our attacks will be magical anyways. And Curving Shot, which lets us, whenever we miss with an attack, use a bonus action to attack the next closest target. This basically lets us gain advantage on our first miss every round. We get to kind of re-roll our first miss every turn, because as long as we have a bonus action to spend on it, and this character doesn't have great uses for its bonus actions typically, we can use Curving Shot to just re-roll our first miss. It does force us to target a different character with the reroll, but that's okay. As long as there's more than 1 enemy in the encounter, Curving Shot will get a lot of value in terms of making this character, again, even more consistent. It also helps with the fact that we took alert at level 6, so our attack rolls are a little bit low because we have Sharpshooter and we didn't boost our dexterity at level 6, so even if we're using the Graceful Cloth and other hit chance bonuses, Curving Shot will come up pretty frequently because this character can get away with having lower hit chance than another martial character would. We also get an additional Arcane Shot. Now, we still don't want Beguiling or Bursting Arrow, so we're pretty much choosing between Seeking, Shadow, and Enfeebling Arrow. At this level, also, Piercing Arrow is a lot less interesting than it used to be, because there are many fewer encounters with lots and lots of weak enemies that Piercing Arrow can just kill all of at once. So it's possible as well that you want to replace Piercing Arrow with Seeking Arrow. But of these 3, I'm going to recommend taking Shadow Arrow, because Shadow Arrow causes you to blind enemies, and that's just a very powerful crowd control effect on into the late game. Lots of times you're going to want to banish 1 enemy and blind another enemy, so you can kill the second most powerful enemy in the encounter while they're blinded, gain advantage on a lot of attacks, and just give your party a huge advantage in the fight while you wait for the banished enemy to come back. So Shadow and Banish make a good combination, because you can banish one, blind the other and then kill it while it's blinded, and then the banished one returns, you blind that one and kill him too. So, Shadow Arrow is my recommendation for level 7. At level 8, we get another feat, and the feat that we're going to take is, of course, an ability score improvement to boost our dexterity. At this point, we definitely want to increase our dexterity, so we want to make sure that we have the highest possible damage and hit chance, as well as increasing our initiative. I also, at this level, am going to recommend swapping out Piercing Arrow. Fights tend to be longer range at this level, and the AoE damage is less valuable, though Piercing Arrow is still very useful, so if you're finding yourself using it a lot, then you can keep it rather than swapping for Seeking Arrow, but I think Seeking Arrow will come up a few more times in later levels, so this is a swap that I think is pretty reasonable to make sometime around this point, though again, not mandatory. At character level 9, we have no other decisions to make, but we do get Indomitable, which is, of course, extremely useful for this character. Again, pretty much the only thing that we are worried about is failing mental saving throws against something like a Mind Control or Paralyze effect. So having Indomitable just makes us even better at succeeding on those. This works still with the advantage from Gnome as well, so if you were a Gnome, then Indomitable does work with that, and you'll reroll with advantage again. So this is just a very, very powerful class feature, and another reason that fighters are so good as you continue to level them up. At character level 10, we get additional uses of our Arcane Arrows, and again, this is 3 more uses per short rest. This takes us up to 10 uses of Arcane Arrow per short rest, or 30 per long rest, and that's before we count bards or anything that gives us additional short rests, which lets us be extremely spendthrifty with our Arcane Arrow charges. We can now start pretty much every fight by action surging and spending 4 Arcane Arrow charges, and we'll still have plenty left for the rest of the fight. That lets you banish 4 enemies, banish 3 enemies and blind 1, blind 2 enemies and banish 2, do a bunch of damage across all of the encounter, a lot of which can't miss, or just do a ton of damage with Grasping Arrow and forcing enemies to come towards you. This character now just gets so many resources. It's similar to Monk. You can spend your crowd control abilities extremely aggressively and just take entire encounters out before they ever get to act. We also get an additional Arcane Shot at this level, and there's really 2 choices. You can pick up Piercing Arrow, which does still come up. There's a couple late game encounters where you need to do a little bit of damage to a bunch of different enemies at once, but the damage on Piercing Arrow probably isn't that exciting at this point without Sharpshooter, and the guaranteed damage from Seeking Arrow is probably more useful, so I'm going to recommend taking Enfeebling Arrow, because Enfeeblement plus Blind basically shuts down any character that's relying on weapon damage, and there's a lot of late game bosses that do weapon damage, so having Shadow Arrow and Enfeebling Arrow together can just completely ruin the day of even some of the most dangerous bosses in the game. Banish everything you don't want to fight, blind and enfeeble everything that you do want to fight, and all of your fights are very, very easy. Again, though, Piercing Arrow is still totally fine, so you could take that. You could also swap Grasping Arrow out at this point, because it will be a little bit less used than the crowd control effect, but it's still a lot of damage, so all of these arrows that we have are very good. At character level 11, as a fighter, we get improved extra attack, which gives us a 3rd attack per action, or 6 attacks if we use Action Surge. 7 if we have haste, 8 if we have haste and bloodlust, 9 if we have haste, bloodlust, and Terrazul. You get the idea. We have 10 charges of our Arcane Arrows, so even if you're using a lot of action economy improving stuff, you can you can make Arcane Arrow attacks with every one of your attacks in the opening round of combat. Improved extra attack not only is just an incredible damage boost, it's also an incredible utility boost for this character, because all of our attacks have so much utility attached to them. Again, being a fighter is just so good, and this character is really good at being a fighter, so we're very happy anytime we get one of the awesome fighter abilities. At character level 12, we get to take an additional feat, and the feat that we're going to take is, of course, an ability score improvement to max out our dexterity. Obviously, we want the highest hit chance and damage, so we're just going to boost our dexterity to maximum. If you have additional dexterity from some other source, or you are using a mod that gives you additional feats, like the Feats at Even Levels mod, there are a couple other feats that are worth considering. Also, if you took Ethel's Hair to get 17 dexterity, you can take Athlete to boost your dexterity to 20 and get a little bit of additional jump distance, which is also very good. Some other feats that are worth considering are, of course, Lucky. That feeds right into this character's plan of just never failing at anything, and Lucky just gives you even more chances to succeed at everything that you try to do. And Mobile is also pretty useful for this character. It gives you the ability to just stay away from enemies, which of course is an archery character you want. Tough is worth considering also. 24 additional hit points just makes you even harder to kill. Not a feat that I would normally recommend, but if you're using an extra feats mod, then Tough is totally reasonable. And another feat that's usually pretty bad that's actually kind of cool for this character is Martial Adept. Learning 2 maneuvers and using them once per short rest is a very small amount of additional power, but precision attack once per short rest for a really important hit roll is not horrible either. So while I certainly wouldn't recommend this feat, it's a little more interesting for this character than for other characters that aren't Battle Masters. Alright, my friends, that is the Arcane Archer, but of course, this character needs a bow and other assorted equipment, so let's talk about that. 4 items for this character. There are a few specific items that really boost the power level of Arcane Archer, so generally I would prioritize this character's itemization over most other characters in your party. This character has stronger benefits from specific items than most other characters in the game, so we want to make sure that they get the items that they want to use. Of course, as an archer, the first thing that we need is going to be a bow. In the early game, we're going to want to use the Titan String Bow. It's just the most damage that we can do. Deals extra damage equal to our strength modifier, which we can improve to 21 with the Elixir of Hill Giant Strength, or 27 with the Elixir of Cloud Giant Strength. Just the highest damage possible setup. The Titan String Bow also does apply the damage to Seeking Arrow, so while Sharpshooter doesn't work, the extra damage from Titan String does, so it's guaranteed extra damage. In the late game, we can either stay with this setup with the Titan String, or swap to the Deadshot, which makes our character even more consistent. The extra hit chance is so valuable in the late game, and our damage is so high already that in general I prefer the Deadshot. Also, critical hits are really good, but either of these two setups is going to be excellent, and those are the weapons that you're going to want to use throughout the entire game. In addition to that, we want anything that increases our damage per shot. An item like the Helldust Gloves, for example, adds damage to all of our weapon attacks, and that's exactly what we want. The more damage we do per attack, the better we're going to do. The Helldust Gloves in particular are also great because they increase our spell save DC, which is amazing for this character because increases to our spell save DCs make our arcane arrows more likely to land. Other solid early game items include the Gloves of Archery, again just more damage per shot, though we're going to want to replace these with one that add damage dice rather than flat damage additions, because damage dice can work with critical hits and the flat damage does not. And the Marksmanship Hat. Hit chance, of course, is very important for this character, so increases to our hit chance are going to be excellent. As we get later into the game, we're going to want to improve the power of our character even further. The Graceful Cloth is going to be really good to make sure that we have at least 18 dexterity even before we take our ability score improvement at level 8. The Gloves of Dexterity can do the same thing, but the Graceful Cloth occupies a less important item slot typically, and this character can get away with having relatively lower AC because we're going to be playing at very far distance, so it won't particularly matter that the Graceful Cloth doesn't give us that much in the way of armor class. Of course, you can also have a character cast Mage Armor when you're using the Graceful Cloth to boost your AC even further. In the late game, you're going to want one of the medium armors with uncapped dexterity bonus to your armor class, like the Armor of Agility, which gives you very high armor class in the late game and makes this character extremely difficult to hit. Increases to our damage can come in a bunch of other forms as well. The Diadem of Arcane Synergy is actually pretty nice for this character also, because we're inflicting a lot of conditions, and there's ways to get them on every attack as well. Gaining Arcane Synergy will just increase all of our damage to by +3, because Arcane Synergy just applies to all of our weapon attacks, and we have 16 intelligence. We can also increase our other stats more if we want to use the Warped Headband of Intellect to gain 17 intelligence rather than the 16 we took in character creation, so you can get a few more con points, you can get higher wisdom, you can get away with the greedy attribute split if you don't have to put any points in intelligence and end with 17, 16, 15, and then boost your constitution, wisdom, and dexterity all with items and ASIs. But the Warped Headband, I think, is actually not that important for this character because we can just take 16 intelligence and we have better uses for our head item slots regardless. Another one of those is the Grimskull Helm, a great option in the sort of early to mid game. Preventing you from taking critical hits makes this character even safer, and Hunter's Mark is a very solid addition to our damage output. That takes a bonus action, which is something we're not using, and our concentration, which is something we're mostly not using. This character can also benefit from melee weapons. As an archer, even if you have your bow equipped, you benefit from any melee weapon that has a passive effect. So the Knife of the Undermountain King increases the critical hits of all of our weapon attacks. We can also benefit from shields, including, for this character, Ketheric's Shield, to increase our spell save DC on all of our Arcane Archer abilities, making them even more reliable. Speaking of spell save DCs, this character gets to use one of the most broken mechanics in the entire game, Arcane Acuity. Now, normally I'd suggest using the Helmet of Arcane Acuity for a character that wants to use a weapon and then stack Arcane Acuity. The way that this works is it gives you, every time you attack with a weapon, you gain Arcane Acuity for 2 turns, and that increases your save DCs by the amount of turns remaining, up to a maximum of 7, so you can get a huge bonus to the effectiveness of your banishing strikes just by attacking with your weapons, which is something that you want to do anyways. However, for this character, the Helmet of Arcane Acuity in particular is less powerful because Seeking Shot and Piercing Shot don't count as weapon attacks, so they don't trigger the Helmet of Arcane Acuity. One of the combos that you're going to want to do is use those as guaranteed hits in order to stack Acuity before you fire a Banishing or Blinding Arrow. So the best way to do that is to use either the Hat of Fire Acuity or the Hat of Storm Scion's Power, and then use an effect that makes your weapon attacks do that kind of damage. Hat of Fire Acuity requires a specific story choice, but is the better of the two if you have it, because it works with the best in slot gloves, the Helldust gloves, that make all your attacks do fire damage anyways. It also works with just dipping your weapons in fire, so you can just do fire damage with every single attack and always stack Fire Acuity. But if you have a way to make your attacks do thunder damage with the Hat of Storm Scion's Power, then this will stack as well. One way to make your attacks do thunder damage is the Drakethroat Glaive, which of course you can use Draconic Elemental Weapon to enchant your bow with additional thunder damage, making every one of your attacks do extra thunder damage and triggering the Hat of Storm Scion's Power. Another cool combo with the Drakethroat Glaive is to use the Snowburst Ring. Set it to ice damage, all of your weapon attacks do ice damage, and then whenever you attack, you create a 15-foot circle of ice underneath the target. For an archery character, that's an incredible bonus, making your character crowd control enemies at range. Enemies who are standing on an ice surface have to make a dexterity saving throw, and this dexterity saving throw is against your character's spell save DC, which is going to be stacked because you're stacking Arcane Acuity, and they will, if they fail the save, then they fall over. If they do that on their turn, they lose the rest of their turn, so anytime they try to move, they're going to fall over. And also, if you're hitting them with Grasping Arrow and slowing their movement speed, then they're going to be stuck on the ice surface for many, many turns, and probably won't have the movement speed to jump off of it either. So it's even better for the Arcane Archer than it is for other archery builds to do the Snowburst Ring and Drakethroat Glaive combo. Another ring that's pretty good is the Strange Conduit Ring, increasing the damage of all of our weapon attacks. We have Guidance as a spell known, so we have an easy way to get a concentration spell running, and can benefit from the Strange Conduit Ring all the time. Of course, any other ring that increases our damage is going to be excellent. A A couple other specific items that are nice for this build. Any way to gain Misty Step is very useful. We don't have that by default, so an item like the Disintegrating Nightwalkers is very, very helpful for this character. Also helpful if you're making a lot of ice surfaces with the Snowburst Ring to prevent yourself from falling over. And this character benefits a ton from Potions of Speed and Elixirs of Bloodlust, because the more attacks we make, the more we can shut down enemies. So my sort of suggested endgame setup, if you had your ideal items here, oops, wrong button, is the Hat of Fire Acuity and the Helldusk Gloves to trigger Acuity, the Deadshot in order to hit your attacks most frequently, Ketheric's Shield for even further increased spell save DCs, Knife of the Undermountain King, and the Armor of Agility gives you very solid armor class. Then we go with the Disintegrating Nightwalkers in the boot slot, and the Snowburst Ring, and the Strange Conduit Ring as our rings, and use the Drake Throat Glaive in order to give ourselves ice damage in addition to the fire damage on every attack. While this does mean that sometimes you'll melt your own ice surfaces because you're doing fire damage, it's pretty hard to avoid doing any fire damage with the party anyways, so having this character do the fire damage all itself is not that big a difference. And you won't melt the ice surface with the first attack, which is the one that creates it, so you can set up a lot of ice under enemies just by hitting them with all grasping arrows and stack a bunch of acuity. And if you banish an enemy successfully, it won't melt ice that they were standing on, even though you hit them with fire damage. So stacking acuity while shooting the enemies, setting up a bunch of ice surfaces, and then doing the banishment arrow will not then melt those ice surfaces. So there's like a little bit of anti-synergy between using the Hat of Fire Acuity and the Snowburst Ring, but it's not that significant in actual play, I have found, as long as you're just a little bit careful about managing your tools. And these two effects are so incredibly powerful that they're both very much worth taking regardless. Alright, my friends, I hope that you have enjoyed this look at the Arcane Archer, and I hope it helps you out with your honor mode runs. I think that this character is just a blast to play. Anything that just solves so many problems without asking anything of the player or any questions is just so good, I think, and so useful for any honor mode playthrough. As always, of course, if you have enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a comment and hit like. Helps me out a ton with the algorithm, so I appreciate you taking the time to do that. And you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 build guides and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, folks. I'll catch you next time.